Welcome back to the Know Thy Repc series. We're in section 7, seller's disclosures. Okay, so the seller's agreeing by the default language of this contract to provide certain disclosures. So, and it says it starts off at no later than seller disclosure deadline, referenced in section 24A, seller shall provide to the buyer the following documents in hard copy or electronic format, which are collectively referred to as the seller's disclosures. And so in the deadline, section 24A, we'll talk about that when we get there, but there's a whole stack of deadlines throughout this contract. And rather than have those deadlines scattered throughout, there's one section that identifies all the deadlines. So let's get going. Section A written seller property condition disclosure for the property completed, signed and dated by seller as provided in section 10.3. We'll talk about 10.3 later. So there's in our forms in the MLS, there's a seller property condition disclosure. It is a pretty comprehensive, but it's not complete. I mean, there could be other things that may appear, and you can add an addendum to that disclosure document, but it's many pages, 6, 7 pages. So, and it asks questions, do you occupy the property if you've never occupied it, or you haven't occupied it? When was the last time you did occupy it? Never occupied it, whatever. Have you replaced the roof? Are there any problems with the electric, the plumbing, so forth? It goes through and asks a myriad of questions that a buyer would want to know, right? So that's to be provided by the seller to the buyer. And then section B, a lead-based disclosure and acknowledgement for the property, same thing, completed, signed, and dated by the seller, but only if the property was built prior to 1978. So if the home was built in 78, you don't need it. If it's built in 77 or sooner, then you need to provide that disclosure document. Section C, we talked about that in a commitment for title. So the commitment for title was talked about in section 6.1, right? So you're gonna, so when you're the listing agent, you list a property, you should order a title commitment from your preferred title company, or whichever title company the seller directs. If they don't have one, then you can, recommend your preferred title company, if you will. So, and then once you have that copy, then you want to keep that, and then when a buyer makes a contract on that, you provide it to them. So, and that talks about any liens and stuff. Some liens are going to continue to carry on, like property tax liens, they never go away, but mortgages, they're going to, they're to be paid, so you want to know that, because if there's a mortgage for more, let's say you're buying a property for 100,000, but there's a mortgage for 150, well, I think you might want to know that, is the seller going to pay that off? So that's what the title commitment's about. So you got a couple, so the first three are, kind of the first two are kind of what I call physical or tangible, right? Because you're talking about the tangible documents. And then the C is intangible, right? Things about it that aren't physical, right? So does that make sense? So there's more intangibles, right? So a copy of any restrictive covenants, right? We're talking about section D, CC&Rs, rules and regulations affecting the property. So you can be in a HOA that does not collect dues and doesn't have meetings or anything like that, and they can have CC&Rs. Subdivisions have, they could have created CC&Rs that say you have to have a certain amount of stucco on the front or a certain amount of stone or such like that, that you must have a shake roof or anything. They could have anything, and they can apply. And I've seen them, go back from the 40s that had, or, violation of today's equal housing laws. And there's some old rules as a country. I mean, we've come a long way, but they were rules where they just simply discriminated that you cannot do anymore. So they don't change the CC&Rs, they just cannot be enforced. So if you ever get a hands on a CC&Rs that has discrimination in there, just know that they can't be enforced. It's a violation. If the law has changed that, then so be it, right? So, but then there are CC&Rs, say a condominium, a townhouse community where they have common areas that are maintained by the collective body of owners, then where they collect fees and they have dues and such. So you want to get a copy of the most recent minutes, the budget, and a financial statement for the homeowners association. So think about that. If you're buying a condominium, so a great analogy is to use is you're buying stock in a company. So you want to examine the books to determine, do you want to own stock in this company? Because that's essentially the way a condominium works, because you don't own the land. The condominium or the HOA owns all the land, and you own a portion of the HOA. And then you own the rights to the unit, to use the unit, but you don't own the land. You own stock in a company that owns the land, if you will. That's a great analogy. Now, there's not going to be a stock certificate or anything like that, but that's just an analogy of how to understand that. So then let's move on to F, right? You want a copy of any long-term lease or rental agreements that are going to not expire prior to closing. So if you're closing, if you're going to say you're settling on the 29th, you anticipate to fund and record on the 30th, and the tenant is to be out of there on the 28th, well then you know that you don't need to get the documents. But I would suggest a walkthrough to make sure they're gone. A copy of any short-term rental bookings as of seller disclosure deadline. Okay, so for guest use of the property after closing. So you could close on a property this month, and then the next 2 months, each of the next 2 months has a 1 week rental booking. You have to honor that. I mean, so be aware. I mean, you don't want to close on a property and, you know, next month, 6 guys show up with a keg, you know, to go skiing for a week. I mean, that's, you know, not, you know, please know prior to. That's why you want to know. That's why you want disclosure. And if you're also, you know, representing a seller, you want to know that so you can disclose that early on so that people know about that so they don't even make an offer. Now, if there are those bookings, they could be negotiated out. You know, let's say you're with a rental booking company. The rental booking company may be able to move them to another property or such, but you need to be aware, right? So, and then, so H, a copy of any existing rental property management agreement affecting a property, right? So if there's a property management contract that's going to transfer over to the new buyer, to the new owner, well, then obviously you need to know that. And so you want to see that. You want to examine those documents. And then section I, evidence of any water rights or any water shares referenced in section 1.4. We talked about that. Section 1 was what it is you're actually buying. Section 1.4 talked about specifically about water. So if water rights are transferring, now if you're buying in the city and it's just city water, well, that's, you know, that's not water rights. That's that water belongs to the city attached to the property. The property owes the money. But there can be separate shares that could be and it talked about in section 4 how what type will transfer, you know, is automatically included unless excluded. And then this document is saying the disclosure, give me the evidence of those water rights. Okay. So then section J, any written notice of any claims or condition known to seller relating to environmental problems and building or zoning code violations. Okay, so, you know, if the seller has a notice, you know, from an entity, you know, a government entity that says, hey, you know, let's say for, you know, let's say there's meth, well, meth's not really an environmental problem. We'll cover that in seller disclosures. You know, but there's problems. Say, let's move over to the building code, right? But if you had any kind of government say you have an environmental issue, you have to disclose that, or any building or zoning code, right? So building or zoning. So let's talk about, let's say you have a duplex, but the zoning is single family and it's an illegal duplex, and there's what they call legal non-conforming. That's a whole nother conversation. We'll talk about that another time. But let's say your zoning violation or code violations. Let's say you're buying a property from someone who bought the property to fix it up and sell as a flip. They call them flipping, right? So where they bought the property, they did a remodel job and then they're flipping it. Well, if they did not pull a permit, they're in violation of code and they need to disclose that. So just keep that in mind if you're representing a seller. If you did not pull permits, you're in violation of code. Code says you must pull permits on certain things. And if you did not, then you're in violation. You need to disclose, okay? Section K, this is an interesting section, if you will. And there's other documents that address this. It's addressed also in the listing contract. It's also addressed in seller disclosures. It's also addressed in the buyer agency contract. Section K, in general, the sale or other disposition of U.S. real property interest by a foreign person is subject to income tax withholding under the Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act of 1980, aka FIRPTA. So if a foreign person includes a non-resident alien, individual, foreign corporation, partnership, trust, or estate, if FIRPTA applies to seller is advised that buyer or qualified substitution may be legally required to withhold this tax at closing in order to avoid closing delays. If seller is a foreign person under FIRPTA, seller shall be advised in writing and then other, right? So what that means is if the seller is a foreign entity or person, then they may have a tax due, right? A tax due. So the thing that a buyer needs to be aware is that, and that's why it's important to get the disclosures. And if you're not sure, you need to talk to your title company, that the title company will withhold the tax. If the tax is not paid at closing, the buyer is owes the tax. So what the IRS simply did is created a buyer, or basically deputized a buyer to become their tax collector, right? So that's what that means under there. So and FIRPTA is another issue, but just know if you're talking to, and if you are the listing agent, when you signed a listing contract, it says in there, is the seller a foreign person or entity, right? So and if they check yes or no, if they check yes, then you need to drill down and find out what the obligations are. So other could be anything, right? So other could be that, whatever you want, whatever disclosure that the buyer would like to see. So an example would be, let's give an example. Let's see. God, I'm drawing a blank, right? What if, what if a meth test? Maybe the buyer saying, "I want to see the results of a meth test." Now the buyer has the right to inspect, but maybe the buyer is telling the seller, "No, provide me with one." They can put that in there. So I personally recommend that the buyer do their own meth test so that they know somebody that they know and trust is testing in a manner that they would want. So that's seller disclosures. It's a meaty section. But it's a very, very important one. Most lawsuits in involve real estate purchase contracts are based upon lack of disclosure. So do yourself a favor, do your client a favor, make sure everything's disclosed. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and thank you.